Hello, this is Mr. Galley from GCSE English Revision Pod with a quick message for you. If you want even more English Revision Pod in your ears, you can now subscribe to our premium service, GCSE English Revision Pod Plus, where for the price of just over £2 a month, on top of all the amazing free episodes which will continue to be free and there for you to use, you can also get a selection of amazing bonus episodes on things like Macbeth, A Christmas Carol, Romeo and Juliet, and all your favourite topics covered in the depth and detail that you are used to. If you are interested in getting even more GCSE English Revision Pod, all you've got to do is click the link at the top of this episode description where you can subscribe to GCSE English Revision Pod Plus. Hello and welcome to GCSE English Revision Pod, your home of top quality revision and essay writing skills, where every episode myself and my co-host Mr Forster take you through from start to finish, from concept to consumption, from Genesis to whatever the opposite of Genesis is. We take death, I guess. We take you through the process of writing a grade 9 essay on
what you're describing there is very
GCSE.
much like the role of a god. So are you saying that we're like gods?
I'm saying that in the very limited realm of AQA essay writing skills, we have achieved a sort of god. No, I'm not saying that at all. Maybe we're like the Kratos of GCSE essay writing. You know, not on a god level, but certainly, you know, mixing it,
Mix it up.
causing them deep inconvenience. And speaking of deep inconvenience, we are talking today about Romeo and Juliet, and a character who attempts to remove inconveniences from the two main characters. A character who can be interpreted in a number of different ways, really, as all the best ones can. But before we get into that, we should say that in order to get the most out of this episode, you should pause right now. You should turn off your podcast app and do something better. No, you shouldn't. You should pause this episode. You should go to the episode description. You should click on the link, and that will take you to a completely beautifully made handout that you can follow along with. It's got the question, it's got the extract, it's got the key vocabulary, it's got the thesis statement, which is a posh way of saying introduction or better version of introduction. It has then got the 3 main points that we would make and the analysis that we would use in order to do so. So with all that in mind,
as we've said many times before, a great way of using these to revise is download the handout, don't look at our notes, don't listen to the podcast, plan your essay, and then listen to us and be like, what do those guys say?
Yeah, use it as feedback, right? Use it, have a go at the question yourself, see what you come up with, and then see how ours would compare. And it's like getting feedback from your teacher. Then it's like seeing where
divine teachers.
Yeah, I think we need to leave that one bit truly behind now, and instead divert our attention to a man of God. A humble man, a man who appreciated that, you know, religion was a far greater force in the world, and a man who was a great friend to Romeo, yes?
Yeah, so we're doing the Friar, and obviously he seems like a minor character, but it is worth noting that he has the 3rd most lines in the play. He's only got 200 lines less than Juliet. He's right up there. It's Romeo, Juliet, the Friar, then actually the nurse. So in terms of main characters, although he doesn't necessarily feel like one, he actually is kind of a main character. There's a good chance that he could come up. So a bit like our nurse essay that we planned before the summer, it's one that's just worth having up your sleeve. So there's a few obvious main scenes, and the one that we picked is Act 2, Scene 6, which is just before he marries Romeo and Juliet, and he offers some nice advice to them, doesn't he?
Brilliant. So if you haven't already, pause this episode and read over that extract. We won't waste your time by reading it out ourselves, but go and familiarise yourself with it now and make sure it is fresh in your mind. Well, so, you know, speak for yourself. So we are looking then, how is the Friar presented in this extract? How is the Friar presented in the play as a whole? Right, of course, in order to do this well, you will start with what they give you, but you will have other things to say based on your wider understanding of the text itself. So, what would you get into in terms of the thesis statement? Where are
Yeah.
we going with this one?
So, in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Friar Lawrence initially seems a wise and fatherly figure to Romeo, a foil to the dysfunctional and ignorant patriarchs whose ancient grudge plagues 14th century Verona. The friar, like the nurse, enables the lover to meet away from the prying eyes of their respective families. It's also he who marries them. Nevertheless, there is an ambivalence in Shakespeare's characterization, as, despite his best efforts, it is ultimately his plan which brings about the lover's tragic deaths, when his letter to Mantua fails to be delivered, and, more disturbingly, when he finds Juliet alive in the Capulet monument, he abandons her, fearful of the approaching watchman.
So he's a number of things really, you're saying there, aren't you? On the one hand, he's the good guy. He's the one who sees the power of a Capulet marrying a Montague. He's like a mature, reasonable voice in a petty, squabbly, juvenile world. But
But he also
yet,
has a
if I
genuine connection with Romeo. Like, they have real chemistry
yeah.
on stage.
But if I've understood you correctly, what you're kind of saying is that it is the big moments in life that make us, right?
Yeah.
It is when extreme circumstances cometh the hour, cometh the man, right? And when the
It's nice to
hour
have a
cometh,
podcast. You,
exactly, dude. And when his moment does come, he doesn't. He melts into the background. He disappears. He does
not like
not
us. Not like us at
deliver.
all.
No, well, no. If anything, we're far too, far too visible, and would probably be appreciated if we did make a cowardly exit, leaving the main action to the front of the stage. But anyway, we're not going to do that. We're
So,
instead going to present your first
yeah.
argument.
So, in this extract taken from Act 2, Scene 6, we can see the friar's wisdom and his advice to Romeo about the dangers of moving too quickly in his relationship with Juliet.
So initially, he's a character who cautions Romeo. He believes in it's quite the relationship between them is quite beautiful at that point, isn't it? Because he knows Romeo really well, and he knows his weaknesses. He knows that he's young and he's headstrong and he's prone to making very quick emotional decisions. But he's not really patronizing to him, is he? He's not just saying, "Oh, you silly little boy," you don't. He there's a real warmth and depth of feeling here.
He's kind of like not like me when someone comes to me at school with a problem and I've not had any coffee and I'm tired. All that warmth that doesn't come through in my exchange with people does come through in his. So he's a foil to me as well, perhaps. I feel. So I mean, let's look at what his advice is.
I think I think the primary focus for the rest of this podcast should be removing yourself from the. You seem to have approached this episode from the perspective of, oh, what would it have been like if Shakespeare wrote about me? Now, now I've described myself as a god very early on in the episode. What about if what if you use me as a bit of subject matter? Now, I don't want to accuse you of being an arrogant man, but our listeners are a discerning bunch, and I fear for you if this discourse remains unchallenged. I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to be the friar to
Okay,
your excited Romeo at this
impulsive
point.
Romeo. Well, no one's
Exactly.
ever compared me to that before. So, the connotations of Romeo and Juliet's love being violent is interesting. So, this adjective, violent, is it has this real polysemy, like lots of meanings bound up in it, because it can be positive. Violent love actually is a metaphor we often use, like to describe falling in love. It can be seen as positive, but also it, violence in life is also negative. So it's a really interesting word choice by the friar that seems to understand love in a way that perhaps Romeo doesn't yet. That it's violent delights can have violent ends. Violent means two
Mm.
very different things, even though the word is repeated.
Yeah, that's a lovely bit of repetition there, isn't it? And that these how he's subtly highlighting how close extreme feelings are to one another, where we might consider love and hate or love and violence to be opposite ends of an emotional spectrum. The friar is kind of highlighting how actually perhaps that emotional spectrum is more like a circle, and those two things are actually very close to one another if you are not careful in how you approach them.
And we see that in the figurative language too. He compares them in one of the most famous similes of the play to fire and powder, which as they kiss consume. It's a wonderful metaphor because what he does here is he takes the idea of love, and he personifies fire and gunpowder as lovers who, kissing, destroy themselves and blow up.
Mm.
It's a really clever piece of imagery, because it not only compares Romeo and Juliet's love to the destructive power of gunpowder, it also compares the destructive power of gunpowder and fire to love. It's a metaphor that kind of works in both directions. And it sets up, of course, the tragedy that they will die in their triumph. There's also a bit of an early modern joke here as well, because of course, to die on the early modern stage was one of the most overused puns, meaning sexual climax. It's used by so many early modern writers. I read a lot of early modern plays because that's the kind of guy I am, and it's used again and again and again. It's kind of and Romeo and Juliet almost kind of takes that and takes it much further. That of course they don't just die in the way that all lovers on early modern stages die. They really die. They move towards tragedy. So it's a language that recognizes the friars, Kim Miskelly already said, intimately recognize this relationship between violent feelings of love, violent sexual feelings, and the violence that both of them will ultimately do to themselves, taking their own lives tragically at the end of the play.
It relates as well, doesn't it, to his knowledge of herbs and the idea that there's that plant that can give what is it? It's like it used in the right quantities, it does this, but used in the wrong quantities brings pain or whatever. The friar seems someone who understands that the
things aren't single.
the beautiful things in life are intoxicating, and they're beautiful and they're wonderful, but they are also very close and only need a little bit of mishandling before they become the terrible things in life as well.
He does that in his next symphony, doesn't he? The sweetest honey is loathsome his own deliciousness. It's the same image, but with a different metaphorical tenor. That love here can be overly sweet. It can be saccharine. It can take away your appetite. Too much honey is not actually a nice thing at all. If anyone's like me has eaten a whole big bag of Haribo and then felt horrible, it's that feeling, isn't it? That's what he's saying.
The instant regret, the sweetness into regret. Yes, absolutely. Point about then when the sort of structural point about when this comes.
Yeah, so it comes. This is the zenith, the highest point, the moment of their happiness. But it comes, of course, just before the violence of Romeo's encounter with Tybalt, Mercutio's death, Tybalt's death. This is what should be the happiest moment of their marriage, is in fact the beginning of the end, as we're about to see.
Fantastic. Right. So point number 2, we have already seen the Friar's wisdom in Act 2, Scene 3, when he questions Romeo over how quickly he's moved on from his unrequited love for Rosalind, and we will see it again following the tragic deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt. So this is your kind of pro-Friar argument here.
This is a really simple, and you can apply this to all of your literature questions, really. A really simple argument is like pro, against, or against, pro. It's a really, you can use that word ambivalence that we use, which is a great word when you're having mixed feelings. Set up a thesis, there's ambivalence here, and then explore the ambivalence. And so we've got a really simple essay structure here. These are like more clever stuff the Friar says, and we're going to kind of give them. So he's quick to criticize Romeo. Saying that young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts but in their eyes. So his kind of this metonym focusing on Romeo's eyes suggests fickleness and moving on from Rosaline, in quickly falling in love with someone new. He's saying that the love is not coming from his heart but from his eyes. So he's accusing him of fickleness. He then kind of picks up on Romeo's own metaphors from earlier in the play, these kind of hyperbolic, exaggerated images that you might remember from our podcast on love before. And he talks about the brine, so that's the salt water in Romeo's tears that have washed him for Rosaline. He talks about how his salt water was thrown away in waste because it didn't season love. So he uses this cooking metaphor that tears should be used to flavor love, to bring flavor to love, tears of happiness. But in fact, they're just being wasted. It's wasted seasoning. But he's critiquing Romeo, isn't he? He's saying, you seem very shallow. But as we kind of said already, what I really like about this moment is it comes through so well, I think, in the Baz Luhrmann film. I think he really gets this right. He's critiquing him, but not in the way that your worst teachers critique you, in the way your best teachers critique you, where you feel that they still love you and respect you, and it's what good parenting is as well, isn't it? That when you can be told off, but in a way that you don't feel devalued, you still feel like they're listening to you and they want something for you. Because
He's gently mocking him, isn't he? He's mocking him in the sense that he's uh he knows him really well, but there's, yeah, like you say, there's a line, isn't there, between outright criticism and mocking someone to make fun of them, and to sort of gently, lovingly, humorously point out the sort of folly or the silliness in someone, but yet still be completely willing to listen, because he does, in spite of all this brilliant imagery that says, goodness me, you were in love with someone else a couple of days ago, he still believes that Romeo knows his own heart, and he still accepts that, well, if you say that you love Juliet, then I will accept that that is your true heart.
yeah, and we see that there's some hints that on in terms of the how, we can state that, of course, but for an examiner, let's show the examiner how Shakespeare does that. And one is on the early modern, in medieval society by the 1590s, there was two pronouns you could use, you or thou. You was more formal. It suggested either that someone was more important than you, or that someone was kind of emotionally distant from you. So, whereas thou was intimate. Thou is what you say to friends. Thou is what you say to lovers. Thou is also what you say to inferiors. And if we look at the pronouns throughout here, Romeo and the Friar use thou with each other. There's a connection here which we might not expect between a much older man in a position of power and authority like a friar, authority within the Catholic Church here, versus Romeo, who's a kid. We don't see that expected power dynamic. So although the criticism is coming from the Friar, he's framing it in this language. They're speaking in rhyming couplets. They're rhyming, just as Romeo and Juliet do when they first meet. There's this connection. Their language is connecting, and the hyperbole is gentle. He mocks kind of the sighs that have formed clouds to block the sun, for example. He mocks that Romeo's love did read by rote and could not spell. But as Mr. Galley said, this all seems to come from a place that on stage plays out as a really loving, kind relationship, who's mocking him as in a gentle way.
And an understanding, perhaps, you look at Shakespeare's wider understanding of human beings in general, an understanding that young people will do what young people want to do. You are perhaps foolish to try and stop. I'm not saying that young people should just be allowed to do whatever they think is a good idea, but in there's perhaps, in, like you say, in good parenting, in good mentoring, there's an understanding that headstrong young people who believe absolutely, as Romeo does, in a certain course, are going to follow it, and you can either, like their parents do, attempt to shut everything down, not be that supportive, or you can try and guide someone through something in a way that's going to support them, and try and, I suppose it's ironic to say this considering how the play turns out, but try and do it in a safe way, try and do it in a way that's protected.
But I guess
Point three.
here, I mean, maybe just before we do, if you did want to show off your real knowledge of the play, the other moments you could talk about, absolutely no need to. But Act 3, Scene 3, it's the Friar that talks Romeo down from suicidal despair midway through the play. He speaks of how Romeo's wit is misshapen and he fails to see what's good in his life. It's also he that is reassuring to Juliet in Act 4, Scene 1, when she also comes filled with despair. So up until Act 4, he's this figure who is entirely good, who saves, in many ways, Romeo and Juliet from themselves.
Yeah. And yet.
But the final point, of course, that we need to make is, of course, however, whilst Shakespeare's depiction of the Friar is deeply sympathetic, there is nonetheless the suggestion that he ultimately does bear some responsibility for the tragedy.
Yeah.
So I think a few things to kind of note here. A bit of context, first of all. Shakespeare's saw text, we've said many times, he doesn't make up the story. He comes from a very old Italian tale, but Shakespeare came across the story of Romeo and Juliet in a translation in 1592 by a man named Arthur Brooke. But what Shakespeare doesn't do is Arthur Brooke's translation of the Italian tale plays very much on kind of anti-Catholic jokes about friars, because friars were Catholic priests, and England by the 1590s was a Protestant country. So in Arthur Brooke's tale, the friar's a bit of a ridiculous figure because he's a Catholic, and in the 1590s, if you want cheap laughs, you make a Catholic joke. Shakespeare doesn't actually do that. It's quite interesting that although we've got lots of anti-Catholic sentiment following the Spanish Armada, following the Jesuit priests who've kind of infiltrated society, that if you've studied Macbeth, you'll start to know a bit more about. Actually, he doesn't do that at all. The friar's a really sympathetic figure. And yet, despite that, in Act 5, Scene 3, and a moment that's often cut from stage and film productions, the friar arrives at the Capulet monument before Juliet has taken her life. And when she awakes, he initially counsels her to become a nun, but he then leaves. He says he dare no longer stay, given the noise of the approaching watchman. He even admits to the priest that that if aught this miscarried by his fault, then he should be subject unto the rigor of the severest law. That actually there's the sense, isn't there, that he recognizes he admits to the prince that he is culpable. He leaves a 13-year-old girl alone in a tomb with
To take her
her
own life.
to take her own life. And this is not good safeguarding practice, Friar. This is
It's really
horrible.
not, and
It's an awful moment. It's
cowardice on stage is abhorrent, isn't it? It's one of those funny things where, in real life, who knows how people would react in that situation. You hope people do the best thing, but in a dramatic, in a work of fiction, when you see someone behave with that character, it always it strikes me as an incredibly strong criticism by the writer to present someone as a coward, to present someone as someone who doesn't live or die by their deeds. Who in that moment had the chance to either stay and wreck it or try and support Juliet, or stay and hold up his hands and say what he'd done. For Shakespeare to make him just flee is I find it hard not to read that as a real stain on his character in that
But at the same time,
moment.
this is one of the things that I love about Shakespeare. It's one of the reasons that I've dedicated a large part of my adult life to kind of reading about Shakespeare and reading Shakespeare is that you
Hmm.
don't really get simple characters. That like
No.
the Friar is a minor character, and yet he's incredibly complex. We like him
Yeah.
and respect him, and then Shakespeare like, do you still like him now? And you're like,
Mm,
oh, I don't know. How am I supposed to feel that?
yeah.
And actually, there's a sense of creating a human, isn't there? Because we're all filled with these contradictions. We all do really good things. And sadly, all of us fail those around us at various times. I can think of multiple times that
Mm,
I failed people around me in ways that I deeply regret. And
yeah.
Shakespeare kind of explores, even with this minor character, how do we judge him? What do we judge him by his best deeds, or do we judge him by his cowardice in the tomb? And he
Yeah.
leaves that his fate is ambiguous. It's up to us. The prince says all are punished, but then he says some shall be pardoned and some punished in his epilogue. And we don't know if the friar is punished or pardoned. We're never told. We don't know,
No.
does the prince hold him to blame or not? And ultimately then Shakespeare leaves us with a character where we kind of decide, each production, each audience member who sees the play decides whether their version of the friar, is he someone that we should respect, or should we actually just not respect his cowardice? And I think this is something that I think a lot of productions, the tendency, maybe a final point, maybe even for your conclusion, is that there's a tendency in modern productions and films to take away complexity from Shakespeare. We said this in our last podcast. They don't show us Romeo battering Paris to death outside Juliet's tomb
Mm,
because we want to like Romeo. They don't show us this complicated man, and they don't show the friar abandoning a 13-year-old in a tomb because that's going to taint our image of a man who otherwise was a
mm,
fatherly figure. But in Shakespeare's play, these really deeply complex characters exist who perhaps don't fit into our preconceived notions of what we would want them to be. We want the friar to
yeah.
be everything the Montague and Capulet fathers aren't, but he
Mm,
he, he is and he isn't. He
yeah.
certainly is for much of the play, but he ultimately fails Juliet
How
when
much can you
he
be
really.
judged in a single moment, and made in a decision, of course, made in a incredibly stressful set of circumstances as well. That if you were to explore deeper into it, there's of course a difference, I think, between decisions made in the heat of the moment and premeditated decisions. And you're going out on a bit of a tangent now, but our legal system reflects that, doesn't it? A crime that you commit, you would be treated very differently if you were to kill someone who you felt was a threat to your family in that moment, to if you sat at home, planned out how you were going to kill that person, went out and executed it, and then tried to cover it up. We judge very differently actions that happen in the heat of the moment versus premeditated actions done in cold blood. And this is a moment, isn't it, where the friar has to make an instantaneous decision, and he perhaps chooses the wrong one, but it is the work of a moment.
This is fun
Fantastic.
fodder for a conclusion. So I wouldn't bang on for it as long as we have, but it's a fun
No.
little thing to pull out that just isn't it interesting that even a minor character has this level of complexity. What is Shakespeare saying about what it means to be human? That's a really fun way for you. And you can
400
tease
years
out
later.
what you think of that in the conclusion. It's a really fun
Yeah.
way to end the essay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us. We do enjoy hearing from you. You can follow us on X at the letter G, Revision Pod. You can email us, Mr. Forster.
At englishrevisionpod@gmail.com.
And we look forward to seeing you again on GCSE English Revision Pod. Happy revising.